Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the 19th edition of the Financial Risk International Forum, this year on hidden financial risks. This conference is a key event for Institut Louis Bachelier community. It is gathering each year more than 500 participants, academics, but also professionals, supervisors, offering an exceptional opportunity for dialogue and collaboration. Institut Louis Bachelier was created in 2008 as a unique network of academics and professionals, and its core mission is to develop research chairs in economics and finance. It was born as an initiative of the French Treasury, Caisse des dépôts et consignations, Fondation du Risque, and Institut Europlace de Finance, with a founding vision: build a partnership-based research community to help overcome crises, inform public decision-making, and anticipate new financial trends. Today, this community is particularly lively. We have more than 100 sponsoring firms and about 30 partner academic institutions. We have more than 400 active researchers in the community and more than 200 Institut Louis Bachelier fellows. And we also have a lab of 15 scientists working on applied research, climate, artificial intelligence. Institut Louis Bachelier has 4 priority research areas for development: digital technologies and artificial intelligence, climate and environmental transition, economics of social change, which includes demographics, labor markets, and pension, and 4th, systemic and geopolitical risks. The Risk Forum was founded 19 years ago by the Institut Europlace de Finance, one of ILB's research foundation, and its goal is to highlight the methodological and regulatory challenges brought by ongoing advancements in financial technologies and to discuss sustainable solutions. This year, we decided to organize an event on hidden financial risks because we thought that the surge of alternative data, AI, and decentralized infrastructures have revealed new risks that conventional tools often miss. These can arise from opaque and fragile models, biases and manipulations in new data sources, market automation and algorithmic crowding, liquidity fragmentation, cyber and cloud concentration, but also climate and geopolitical shocks. So gathering academics and practitioners to identify, measure, and mitigate these blind spots is necessary to strengthen the resilience of the financial system. So today we'll have 3 plenary sessions on these 3 main areas, major risks: geopolitics, climate, and AI. I would like to say that this edition is very special to me for 2 reasons. The first is that it's the first time I introduce the Risk Forum as director of Institut Louis Bachelier rather than as chair of the scientific committee. As you know, we tragically lost Jean-Michel Béaco last year. His leadership deeply shaped the forum, and I would like to pay a warm tribute to his memory. Second, it's also the first time we hold the event outside of the beautiful Chambre de Commerce et d'Industrie, who many of you know the place, and the venue is no longer available for gathering like ours. So I'm very pleased that we have found a new home for this gathering in the historic Palais Brongniart, the former Paris Stock Exchange, and the current location of Institut Louis Bachelier. So it's a fitting setting for our discussions. Before concluding, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all our speakers and participants for your invaluable contribution to this forum. Thanks for being here. Thanks to Christian Gourierou and the scientific committee for their dedication to making this 19th edition hopefully a success. I would like to thank our partners for their continued engagement and support, in particular the Institut Europlace de Finance, chaired by Eric Campos, Caisse des dépôts, CNP Assurance, Crédit Agricole, Euronext Paris, Société Générale, AMF, BNP Paribas, CCR and Citi. And a special thanks to the sponsors of this event, SCORE Foundation for Science, Natixis, and the Center of Applied Mathematics of École Polytechnique. Of course, a huge thanks to the Institut Louis Bachelier team, Samia, Afida, Feriel, among others. So thanks a lot for all your dedication in organizing the event. I mean, the job you're doing is outstanding. And thanks to Brigitte Lallemand for hosting us in the Palais Brongniart. So my last word is just to encourage you to actively participate to the discussion, challenge ideas, engage with your peers. The real value of this forum comes from the intellectual exchanges we foster here. So with that, I'm delighted to declare open the 2026 edition of the forum and leave the floor for a few words to Christian Gourierou, who is the chair of the scientific committee. So Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So, welcome to the Palais Brongniart for this new edition of the Risk Forum. I will just make some comments on the role of the scientific committee. One of the first role is, of course, to fix the topic every year. In general, we try to have a topic which is a kind of expectation of an important topic for the future of this kind of thing, but recently it has been rather difficult since it was very uncertain on what are the current topics. So this is why you have this kind of title of hidden financial risk. In fact, you have different roles. Maybe as you have seen, we fixed the title, and also in the call, some ideas about what we put within this title to give some directions, okay? And after you have a second step. The second step is that we receive a lot of papers. And so by looking to the papers, of course, we have some ideas of what are the topics on which people are working together. And so more than hidden risk, these are revealed risk. They are revealed by the submission. After you have a third role. The third role of the committee is among these papers to select papers. And we select in a very biased way. In particular for such topics that are not always well known with different degrees of advancement. Okay? Typically, for instance, we have AI, you have seen, or geopolitical risk, and so on and so on. AI, systematically, we don't accept the paper for which you have an automatic use of AI without knowing what is in the algorithm, without taking into account the financial aspect, and so on and so on. And so the papers that are presented have been selected in a very biased way in order to focus on what are really the potential developments, and of course some of them are without any paper at all. Okay? Maybe these are the most important ones. So you will see what are the three main topics, okay? Geopolitical risk, AI, and climate risk, okay? But you will see also in the session sometimes some of the topics, some of them can be more advanced, okay? In particular, you will see the one on cyber risk, for which the technology is more advanced, and even the idea of new products, okay? And also all the things concerning speculative bubbles, commodities, and this kind of thing, okay? So we expect that you will be very pleased in attending the sessions, and don't hesitate to have all comments and to ask questions to all speakers. You will see also that, contrary to what is done in US in general for this kind of meeting, we have some PhD students presenting papers, not only in poster, and this is very important to see what are doing these young researchers. Thanks a lot.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to start us off with the session on geopolitical risks. I think it's a pleasure to have this discussion also with members of the academic community, of the private sectors, of fellow policymakers. Of course, I represent the Treasury, and this is an area of particular focus to us. So thank you. Let me thank the Louis Bachelier Institute for the invitation and for the organization of this risk forum. This is a yearly event that is an exceptional opportunity to exchange views, to exchange ideas, to exchange advancements on the main issues we currently face as policymakers, but seeing also where the academic community and especially young researchers are advancing on these ideas. So, I mean, needless to say, I don't think we need to explain why there is a session on geopolitical risk today. And needless to say, it is an environment of very high policy uncertainty with geopolitical tensions, with trade fragmentation, with downward revision in growth prospects in all areas in the world, or at least in major economies, which are fueling instead risks of financial instabilities. And this is really the result of multiple structural shifts in the post-World War II multilateral order, which underpinned decades of economic integration, predictability, rules-based trade. That is being challenged, and that's the first geopolitical shift, overarching geopolitical shift. We are seeing the importance of economic interdependencies, not just as a reason to trade and to have beneficial trade, but as an instrument to be weaponized in geopolitical conflicts. New tariff regimes, the growing bifurcation of technological systems between major powers, and this is fundamentally reshaping the operating environment for financial institutions, for financial actors, and for markets. That is a juncture that is particularly demanding from a regulatory standpoint, because it is not really just assessing the severity of any single geopolitical shock, but a simultaneous, multiple, interconnected pressures. And that is a challenge in terms of measurement of these shocks in the first place and how they interact with each other. We have supply chain rerouting, we have energy price volatility, of course, very high on the agenda today, driven by conflicts. We have the fiscal consequences of rearmament, which are interacting with pre-existing structural vulnerabilities in ways that may be nonlinear, that may be difficult to model and to fully grasp, and therefore to act on in terms of investment strategies and regulation. At the same time, we are facing a very high level of public and private debt, which is the heritage of past successive crises, which weighs heavily on our capacity to act and react, at the same time as we have to enhance our defense capabilities and invest in the ecological and digital transition. So, I mean, we will have a bit of a focus here on the measurement challenge. Geopolitical risk is not like credit or liquidity risk in that it resists precise quantification. We have standard risk metrics poorly suited to capture tail events of a geopolitical nature, which is really where the risks lie here, precisely because such events are often structurally novel. The indices that we have are composite geopolitical risk indicators, economic policy uncertainty indices, news-based sentiment measures, which are useful and informative, but inherently have a lagging component or backward-looking component, or may be subject to aggregation biases, and this will be also part of the discussion. So this is why it's important to talk about it. It's important to have work like the work that Dr. Iacoviello will present for the economic and financial community to be able to grasp these geopolitical risks. Because it's not just about measurement and information, it is about the consequences for financial stability surveillance of this measurement gap, of really understanding interconnection between geopolitical stress and financial system fragility, which can remain latent for years before crystallizing abruptly on the back of a triggering event. There are contagion pathways that we need to understand through commodity markets, through currency misalignments, through correspondent banking withdrawals, through sovereign risk repricing, which again may stay hidden until they are well advanced and maybe it's too late to act. And yet, if we look today at equity market, they are still at close to record highs, even though we are talking about geopolitical risk pretty much every day in the news. And an area also of vigilance is that certain sectors, and especially AI, are experiencing extreme levels of market concentration. So there is a divergence between geopolitical stress and asset price buoyancy, which itself may be a vulnerability, which may reflect genuine optimism about technological productivity, but may also reflect a compression of risk premia driven by structural demand for yield in a high debt environment, or a collective underpricing of tail risk. And it is important to put the right diagnosis at this time to be able to understand the issue. And maybe last point, this dynamic really prompts us to reassess the resilience of our financial stability framework. While significant progress has been achieved since 2008 and has proven effective during successive crises, we cannot take financial stability for granted in a very unstable world, and we have to understand new challenges that have emerged to make sure that our diagnosis and our regulatory toolbox are fit to present the realization of systemic risk in the world that we are currently facing. Just to conclude, France has the presidency of the G7 this year. It has made this point a specific priority of the presidency, together with global imbalances, which are themselves an element of economic and geopolitical risk when they are large and persistent, and therefore can create financial vulnerabilities and pressures towards trade fragmentation. So this is one of the priorities, assessing the new financial stability challenges also. And this is an area in which discussions among policymakers are progressing, especially in this forum, but really further inputs from academics and the private sector are a useful tool to move forward in the most effective way when we start discussing policy responses. And this is, of course, here one of the great opportunities to have exactly this discussion. So I'm looking forward to it. And to start us off, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Matteo Iacoviello, who will talk about measuring geopolitical risk using AI.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. This is new work I've been doing on measuring geopolitical risk using artificial intelligence, and the usual disclaimer applies. Everything I'm going to say is my views only. Many of you may, I hope, are familiar with earlier work of mine I did with Dario Caldara a couple of years ago, trying to measure geopolitical risk using newspapers. In that approach follows a long tradition in economics of using text to gather data. And in particular, in the approach we use to measure geopolitical risk, we follow the tradition that in economics became very familiar with the work of Baker, Bloom, and Davis, which boiled down to something very simple. You look at the universe of newspaper articles, you decide which ones you want to look at, and you typically count words or combination of words in order to measure a particular phenomenon. So in the famous case of economic policy uncertainty, you will look for words in newspapers containing economics and policy and uncertainty. In the work we did on geopolitical risk, we expanded this approach to look for particular combinations of words that typically will signal the presence of geopolitical risk. We gave our own definition of geopolitical risk, and then if a newspaper article was mentioning, I don't know, the word war within 2 words of the word threat, or the word war within 2 words of the word begin, there will be an article that we will consider measures geopolitical risk. And that approach, which I will call text-based in a way, is very popular, is very simple. It has the advantage of being replicable, something that probably we could discuss a lot about. It comes at a cost. Sometimes these text-based or dictionary-based approaches, in which you select the words before, have the limitation that they cannot easily tell context. within an article. So you cannot easily say whether an article that talks about a war beginning talks about a movie that talks about the war that begins in the movie, or it's actually talking about Russia invading Ukraine. In a way, and also when you want to deepen a little bit the analysis and you want to narrow down the concept to specific concepts, say whether a war threatens oil supplies, you obviously face much bigger challenges because you want to narrow the context of words and maybe you don't have that many articles, or you may be easily looking for finding false positives. Large language models, AI in short, change a little bit this because, as you all know, large language models have the potential to interpret text in a very sophisticated way, given how many parameters they have. So the transformers they have built inside have the advantage that just like a research assistant, they can go through the text of an article and catalog each of them. They probably can do so at a scale that's impossible for humans. And what I want to tell you is simply about our quest in trying to measure geopolitical risk using a different approach than just counting words in newspaper, which I will call, which will build to the concept of this AI GPR index. And then I will tell you a bunch of applications that one can do with AI that are not easily pursued using other methods. So what we do in this work is to build a daily measure of geopolitical risk using 5 million newspaper articles, using from 1960 through today, using one of OpenAI's large language models, ChatGPT 4o Mini. This is not the one that you have access to. If you just go to ChatGPT, the model that they have is actually even larger, but it's a model that's good enough to classify articles based on sentiment, and it's actually much faster, and for our purposes is also cheaper than a typical approach that you could do using, say, the desktop-based version of ChatGPT. And we need to take care of time and cost, because when you want to measure geopolitical risk using the universe of newspaper articles from 1960 through today, if you limit yourself, say, only to 3 newspapers in the US, New York Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune, the sample we are talking about is something like 5 million to 10 million newspaper articles. So what we do is to construct the AI geopolitical risk index. We use the same newspapers as in our original paper with Dario Caldara. We use LLM to score each individual article on a scale from 0 to 1, depending on how salient risks are within an article. And then we aggregate within a particular day, and then we construct the daily measure. And in particular, as I will show you later, we can build new measures that can exploit the advantage that LLM models have in capturing nuances within articles. So we can construct an oil-based measure of geopolitical risk. We can construct country, but also bilateral-based measure of geopolitical risk between countries, or we can separate different event types within the same concept. So, imagine you want to catalog the entire universe of newspaper articles in the US. You want the 3 newspapers articles I talked about. You will have to do a lot of work because a lot of newspaper articles obviously don't talk remotely about geopolitical risk. They may talk about sports, they may talk about gardening, travel, finance, you name it. So the first thing we do is to narrow down the universe to just a smaller set, not too small, that is likely to talk about geopolitical risk. And the way we do so, we pre-select from the universe of about 10 million newspaper articles, only the ones that mention words that potentially remotely could be related to geopolitical risks. And some of them, you can see them here. Well, if it was, I guess I don't have a, okay, but you can see which ones I'm talking about. This box here that talks about article queries. So if an article contains any of these words, we look at it more closely. And we're talking about 4.6 million articles. And it's a very conservative filter. And then the next thing we do is the following. It's a very simple approach. You can feed each individual article to the LLM model, and you can help the LLM model in the following sense. I will define the concept for you, and then you have to tell me whether this article talks or not about geopolitical risk. So in our approach, for instance, we use the same definition we had in our original paper. Geopolitical risk is the risk associated with adverse events such as wars, terrorist attacks, and so on. And of course, you may disagree on the definition, but then it's very easy for you to change the definition and to construct your own measure of geopolitical risk if you disagree with the definition, if you want to broaden it or make it narrow. And then we ask to score articles on a scale. So 0.2 if maybe there's a loose mention of it, 1 if we're talking about a big event, a big risk event that's happening or that could be happening. And then we make clear that we want to remind the LLM model that if we're talking about a movie or we are talking about an event that happened 50 years ago, we don't want the LLM to catalog that as a geopolitical risk. So we try and be as close as possible to what we will tell an array to do, except that we pay much less the API than for doing this with 5 million articles. So just to give you an example, these are 2 articles from this year that are cataloged by the LLM model. You can feed the entire text, but sometimes that's too much. We feed only the first 500 words, the first 2,000 characters, more or less. A word is on average 4 characters long. And then we ask the LLM model, what do you think this article talk about? And interestingly, you can see that an article that remotely mentions geopolitical risk gets a score that's very low. An article that maybe contains the word war, but talks about something else, like a movie, you won't see it, but it's a 0. And this article here, which is the day after the Iran supreme leader was killed, will be scored as 1. So every day, you have an entire universe of articles. You have the scores from each of them. You sum them up. Then so that will be the summation to the right. You divide by the number of articles in the newspaper in a particular day, and that gives you a measure of the intensity of geopolitical risk on that day. So if every newspaper article on a given day were to talk about the worst things happening, the summation divided by the number of articles would be 1, but in general it's going to be a much smaller number. And then there is some rescaling to suit whatever scale you want to use, and this is our AI GPR index. And it correlates, as you can see, with our original index. But first, before I show you the comparison with the original one, I want to show you how the index looks like in history. This is on a 30-day moving average basis. Geopolitical risks were very high in the 60s and in the 70s when there were a lot of wars. There was a lot of events, in particular the Cuban Missile Crisis or a lot of wars between in the Middle East. Then there's a slight decline in geopolitical risks all the way through the 2000s, and then geopolitical risks start creeping up. Obviously, the big spikes start with 9/11. Then there is the war in Crimea in 2014, Paris terrorist attacks, and then you have the bigger, more recent spikes. You don't see the Iran's war here, because the index stops at the end of 2025, just for this chart. And for comparison with the original GPR index, you may say you wasted your time, because in the end you could have gotten the same result just by counting keywords. But it's reassuring that, of course, what we did earlier cannot be thrown away, and it's a good kind of robustness check that the 2 measures are in agreement. But as you can see, there are some differences, and in particular, I'm going to show you some of them as we move along. Now, every time you do these things, you want to be worried about making sure that your measure is correct, that there are no biases, and we could spend an entire hour or 2 talking about that. We won't, luckily. I want to tell you just a couple of things. One thing we did was a simple human check of reading 1,000 articles and comparing our scores with what AI gave. And the correlation was very high. So in the end, one may think, okay, AI may know more, may know less, may have its own biases. We didn't find any remarkable differences between the way we were scoring articles and the way AI was doing. Oftentimes, we will find ourselves giving a high score to an article only to realize that actually AI did a better job than us. So all told, when we looked at the correlation between what we did and what AI did, the correlation was very high. The kind of errors we did were very similar to the ones that AI did. One important thing I want to mention is the fact that the type 1 error, that is the share of articles that AI incorrectly flags as mentioning geopolitical risk, is actually much lower than the type of error you get when you count only specific keywords using the old-based approach. So we think that all told, AI is better than using keywords-based approach. Yeah, it may be, there's an open question whether it's better or not than humans, but we will never know at full scale because for humans to code 5 million articles, it will take quite some time. Another way to look at how accurate the AI GPR is will be to compare how it moves very closely in proximity to very specific events. Now, the news cycle is very erratic. So even though the event is there, you can see day-to-day fluctuations in the number of articles mentioning a particular phenomenon. And you may be familiar with this if you just open a newspaper or if you go to the web page of any major newspaper. This is what happened during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One thing I want to highlight here is the fact that in general, the AI-based measure seems to be less volatile and more persistent than the text-based one. And I think this holds promise because it tells you that there is probably inherently less noise into a measure that correctly scores articles and ranks them by intensity. So the spikes are very similar, but for instance, you don't see big up and down fluctuations in the AI-based index during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can get similar conclusions also if you look at the Iran war. You can do comparisons with any event of your liking if you want to do so. The data are online. You can zoom in, out. You can do daily, 7-day, monthly, and you can download the data so you can do all this work for me. Now, let me show you just a couple of applications. These are not applications in the sense, okay, I can make money with it easily because obviously there is a lot of hindsight in what I'm going to show you, but they definitely show the potential of using this index for a variety of contexts. Some of them were already mentioned before, and we'll go to them in just 1 second. So I just want to show you the potential of using the AI GPR index in answering specific questions. One question typically, at least I see lots of investment banks ask all the time, what happens to stock returns when geopolitical risks go up? And again, you could feed all they say into an AI model and ask, what do investment banks say? And probably you will see a lot of disagreements. Some say, oh, it's a short-term pain, but in the long run, it doesn't matter. Or stock markets typically ignore it. So how do we get to that answer? Well, I thought, let's revisit this using our index here. So the only thing we did was to aggregate geopolitical risk to a weekly level. So each week, you can calculate cumulative stock returns. And each week, you can calculate geopolitical risk from Monday through Sunday. And what is the relationship between the two? If you run a very simple OLS regression, you get a coefficient that it's negative and significant. It's not large, so maybe that's kind of reinforces the notion that it's not a huge deal. So for instance, a 1 standard deviation change in the geopolitical risk index reduces stock returns by 14 basis points within 1 week. Now, big shocks can be easily 5 to 6 standard deviations here because they're very skewed. So there will be like, on average, a 1 percentage point decline in stock returns. It doesn't explain a lot. The R-square is not shown, but it's very low, as you can imagine. What's interesting, however, is if you decompose stock returns into 2 components, so this is a very simple decomposition you can do. You can decompose the stock geopolitical risk, into a predictable component and to an innovation. So take the geopolitical risk, regress it on its lags, and extract the shock. Then you can distinguish the predictable component of geopolitical risk from the unpredictable one. And then you run the second column regression in which you look at what happens to stock returns when I isolate the persistent component and the shock component. So in a way, you're just taking one variable and splitting into two. So the R square is going to be the same, and the weighted sum of these two coefficients in column 2 is going to be the same as the sum as the coefficient in the first one. What's interesting is that the predictable component of geopolitical risk, the persistent component, has a much larger coefficient and more significant than the unpredictable one. So in words, that is telling you that markets price the long tail of geopolitical risk more than short-term innovations. So stock returns, if anything, react more like slowly to geopolitical risks than just to big spikes. Another application that one can use the index for, and this again shows you the potential of using AI for this. How much time do I have? I just want to make sure they don't... Okay, good. 10 minutes is good. So another application that one can use, and that already shows you the kind of things you can do by combining the definition of phenomenon with the use of LLM models, is the following. Imagine that you have all the articles that you measured, that you looked at, that were measuring geopolitical risk. And just to give you an idea, we are talking about, there's like 10 million newspaper articles to begin with. 4 million potentially may talk about geopolitical risk. In the end, exposed, when you look at them, probably 1 million remotely mentioned geopolitical risk. So you can take 1 million articles, or you can take the subset of them that has a very high score, the ones with the high signal-to-noise ratio. So you end up probably with 400,000 of them, 300,000, and then you do the following. You give these articles back to the LLM model using a new prompt. For instance, the new prompt could be something like this. I'm going to give you an article that talks about geopolitical risk. Trust me, tell the LLM model that. And I want you to tell me whether this article, besides mentioning geopolitical risk, also mentions something else. In this particular application, if it mentions the potential for oil supply disruptions, and it could be because there is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or because there's a conflict in an oil-producing region, or because a country is sanctioned, or there's an embargo on the production, on the exports of oil. So whenever there is an article like this, just tell me where it's happening and whether you find such an article. And then construct an index only based on this concept. If you do so, you can construct the oil GPR index. Again, you could do this using keywords, but imagine how many false positives you will find. Because imagine you have an article that mentions geopolitical risk, already with probably some error, and then you simply just look for the word oil in it. You don't know whether the article is mentioning oil because oil prices went down, because there was like 9/11, there were concerns about demand, or because oil prices went up because there was a risk of a supply disruption. So when you constructed this new concept, you can see, for instance, that the oil-based geopolitical risk index doesn't spike around terrorist events like 9/11, because that was an event that, at least initially, was not remotely connected to the supply of oil. And the big spikes that you see in the oil-based GPR index are all around episodes that involve the conflict or the risk of a conflict in an oil-producing region. So many of these spikes are in the 70s, during the Arab-Israeli war, or around the Iraq war, or around the Gulf War in 1990s, the Iraq war in 2003. And obviously, as you can imagine, the oil-based GPR index was extremely high in March of this year for a combination of factors. One of them is the fact that the conflict conveniently started almost on March 1st. So we had the kind of concerns about oil for almost 1 month at this point. And one can use these in combination with movements, for instance, in oil prices that are plotted here just as a reference to answer specific questions, such as, imagine that you want to address the question, what happens if oil prices go up? You can ask the question unconditionally, but then you don't know why they're going up. They could be going up because of demand, could go up because of supply. Or you can ask the question, okay, what happens if oil prices go up because of geopolitical concerns? So you have a very specific, narrow question that now you can give a precise answer to. And we did all of that using external instruments. I'm going to spare you the details. What we found is that in response to a geopolitically driven oil price shock, such as one that brings and scaled to bring oil prices up by 50%, because more or less this is what already happened so far. These are the predictions for, say, oil production, for US GDP, and obviously this is just a cross-check that the AI GPR index would go up. So this is mostly an application of the index and gives you the potential of using AI tools in combination with the concept to draw inference on a particular question. In the final application, I want to show you the potential for using LLM applied to geopolitical risk to answer a new question, which is, okay, oftentimes there are geopolitical risks, but one may say, okay, it really matters if geopolitical risk involves two countries which are remotely connected to the US or to France or to Europe, vis-a-vis whether geopolitical risk involves countries which are much closer to the country I'm interested in. And one thing one can do, again, feed back all the articles mentioned in geopolitical risk, and then ask the LLM model, I want you for every article, tell me which country was the initiator of the geopolitical concerns, which country was the respondent, and which country were caught in between. And it's incredible to see even this very simple question, it's a bit of a complicated question actually, but you can get very precise answers from the LLM model. And the best way to convince you is actually to look at specific charts such as this one. Okay, you may not remember every event, but for instance in 1982, at some point Argentina decided they wanted a piece of an island that was off their coast, and they went there and they said, this is ours. But it wasn't theirs, it actually belonged to the United Kingdom, and Great Britain responded very quickly. But interestingly, even though there was a spike in geopolitical risk, you can actually see very clearly that Argentina started, look at the top left, so geopolitical risk goes up, but this is because Argentina is initiating a conflict and UK is the respondent. So a lot of articles were of the kind, Argentina started this thing, or Argentina moved their troops, and the UK is planning their response. And then the LLM will tell you, Argentina is the initiator, the UK is the respondent. And then Great Britain came back, and they took the island back. It's still contested, I think, as of now. But you can see that geopolitical risk was up for 2 months, but at the beginning it was because of Argentina, and afterwards it was because of the UK. And then you can look at every other event. Post-2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Still, most of the articles are talking about Russia kind of pounding on Ukraine rather than the other way around. And then you can look at World War II, and you can see the sequence of events. At the beginning, Germany is attacking, and then UK is on the back foot, and then things turn around. Similarly, if you compare Japan vis-a-vis the US. So you can see that the advantage of LLM models is that yeah, you may not believe everything that they give you, and oftentimes you have to check. But when they give you answers, you always have to compare them to the counterfactuals. I don't have any way to measure this phenomenon. Now, what can you use this stuff for, besides just having fun and checking all the pairs in the world and who did what and when? One application that I wanted to show that goes back a little bit to what was mentioned earlier. If you are interested, for instance, in trade between countries, there's a big concern, okay, do countries that fight wars trade more? Obviously not. But it's very hard to have measures of bilateral geopolitical risk across countries, whereas we have good measures of bilateral trade between them. And in one application, one thing we did was to actually look at the pairs with the largest geopolitical risk and just correlate them with the bilateral trade after removing country and time fixed effects. And you can see that there is a negative relationship between bilateral geopolitical risk and bilateral trade. That is, after controlling for country fixed effects and for time effects, in general, an escalation of geopolitical tensions between countries leads to a reduction in bilateral trade between them. So these are just applications that show you the potential of the index, which leads me to the conclusion. I want you to believe everything I said, but even if you don't believe everything that I said because you don't want to believe everything that LLM said, I think this shows you the potential of the approach for kind of learning new tools. And the technology to learn all of this is not extremely costly. I mean, it is in fact now using LLM, you can do a lot of the coding work almost by yourself. What you need obviously is a good subscription to a service that sells you the text of the articles, but maybe through your institution or through your school you can get one. But you can see how the wealth of questions we as economists are interested in answering is actually, it's possible to address many of these questions now in ways that it wasn't possible before. So with that, I'm just going to wrap it up. I showed you 4 applications: stock returns, oil shocks, networks, and I hope you will embrace this journey with the same passion in which I'm embracing it. Thank you.
We can take a few questions. I can start maybe, and maybe there are questions here. Okay. Oh, so sorry. First. Okay, I can start maybe. So first of all, it's super interesting and very useful, I guess, for professionals in the market. My first question is about the fact that this indicator is US-centric in the sense that you're analyzing US newspapers. So I was wondering, even if you're looking at bilateral relationships, how much the picture might change, because these are US journalists writing, if we were taking a European perspective. So maybe it's more work, for future work, because that might be quite different. And then a question for central bankers: how much shall we consider geopolitical risk in setting central bank rates or fixing monetary policy? We see it has a lot of impact potentially on inflation. You showed the impact on the oil price, but also on real decisions of households and companies, in particular the persistent component, because these geopolitical risks can be very persistent. So my question is it a new risk we should take into account for monetary policy?
So I'll start with the second question. I start with the usual disclaimer again. Everything I say is my views. I'm not a central banker, I'm a researcher at a central bank, which is a big distinction. Central banks already take into account risks in their outlook. They do so in many ways. One that you're probably familiar with is the fact that oftentimes they will have their baseline projection for the outlook, but they like to describe what they think about what could happen should the risks materialize, and they do so using, for instance, scenarios. So there is a sense in which they take them into account because they are aware of them, and they tell you what they think they will do to interest rates and what will happen to other macro variables should these risks materialize. So that's one approach they use all the time. Some they do so more than others. For instance, at the Fed, the staff routinely presents central bankers with scenarios around the baseline, which involve risks such as these ones. Then there's a separate question, which is, okay, what should I do if there is a risk that hasn't materialized, but I want to take that into account? And obviously, it depends a little bit on how these risks affect the variables that central banks care about the most, which are inflation, outlook, and financial stability. So central banks already take these risks into account, and probably the emphasis is more on those risks because these risks have become more salient, and we have we have also better ways probably to think about them. Now, back to the easier question, which is what do we do about the fact that newspapers are mostly in the US? So we started with US newspapers mostly for 2 reasons. So one is that they're in English, which could be convenient for some of us. The second is that also it was a limitation of the subscription we have access to. And also the advantage is that the archives go back quite some time. It's possible to do all of these using other newspapers. One could use already the Financial Times, which is less US-centric, or could use foreign language newspapers. I encourage everyone to do so. And there is work that's already been done comparing measures of geopolitical risk across newspapers. So for instance, there's this article showing that if you were to measure geopolitical risk using Russian media, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a big deal in US newspapers, also because they reframe the words. They call it military operation, they don't call it war. This is a well-known example. In our index, one thing we did when we showed the country-based measures or even the bilateral risk measures, we weighted them by frequency of occurrence in newspapers. And you can see there, you can go to the webpage and actually plot all the charts you want, that most of the risks that are featured are risks involving the US, but there are cases in which all the foreign risks, even leaving the US aside, add up to a large fraction of US risk. So I think the key distinction is that newspapers in the US may talk more about things that matter for the US, but to the extent that the US is a big player, that's probably not a huge cost. But by all means, I encourage work using other newspapers to cross-check our approach.
Thank you. Yeah, time for just maybe one quick question.
Okay. Yeah. Then it was along the same lines, but my colleague can frame it a lot better.
So I had a question about your conditions of research. You just mentioned that you didn't really consider using other than Financial Times because of the subscription conditions. But what would your hypothesis be if you used more European-based on more European conflicts? Like if we considered French newspapers compared to the Russian war, would it change the JPR index at all, or what's your take on this?
It's, having not done it, I don't have the answer. But again, you can do one thing where you take our measure and you strip out every article mentioning the United States. That's very easily done. And you will see that that measure will immediately tilt toward European events. So for instance, 9/11 will lose importance relative to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The conflict in the Balkans in the 1990s will get higher weight. So these are all things that at least using our newspapers can be done.
Thank you very much. I think with that we need to move to the roundtable discussion. So Matteo, thank you very much for a very insightful talk.
Okay, so we will go to the roundtable discussion. So I'm Charles-Albert Leval, professor at École Polytechnique, and I will try to guide the panelists into this question about the geopolitical risk and financial risk, how they go together. So, of course, doing this kind of what Matteo have shown us, this kind of monitoring of the narratives is something that is important. Now, from a financial perspective, understanding how it can affect and how this kind of indicator can be used as a diagnosis to try to do something to protect banks, institutions from geopolitical risk is another story, and it is what we will explore with attendees. So you know already Dorothée Rouzet, who is chief economist at French Treasury. But I've been joined by Sébastien Jean, professor of economics at Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, a member of France Conseil d'Analyse Économique. He is also associate director with IFRI, where he's in charge of the Geoeconomics and Geofinance Initiative. We've got also Anna Simoni, who is directrice de recherche at CNRS CREST and professor of econometrics at NSAE and École Polytechnique. And we've got Julien Pincet, who is the head of research for the Geofinance project at Institut Louis Bachelier. So with them, we will try to link together geopolitical risk and financial risk. And I will start by Dorothée, asking you if we want to understand the potential impact of the geofinancial risk on the financial system, what would be the first topics, items you will look at and you will attract our attention on?
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah. Yeah, I think we can start with the fact that I mean, we're living through a period of very intense geopolitical tensions, and at the same time, the reaction of financial markets has overall been fairly benign. So we have this disconnect, but this may suggest that imbalances are accumulating in portfolios, in leveraged portfolios that we are not really fully seeing yet. And the other puzzle is, since last year, we've also seen sometimes some asset classes not behaving the way they usually do. And of course, by that, I'm referring to the dollar weakening, including through some risk-off episodes, weakening after the imposition of tariffs, where our models would have predicted the opposite. Gold sometimes appreciating in periods of risk appetite, and some indication that the dollar may have slightly, I would say, lost its status as the absolute safe haven, and that there is increased demand for hedging against the dollar. So we see some foundations and very well-established relationship shaking a little bit, and that's already a cause to wonder. Now, if I'm answering more directly your question, what would be the pockets of risk I would look at? I think we have to think of geopolitical risk first as an amplifier, so where there are existing fragilities, to think about, well, can geopolitical risk be a trigger for something happening there, or be an amplifier where there is pre-existing risk? And I'll list maybe four domains. The first one is very high valuation in US tech, and especially the US AI sector, and the very high concentration. So, I mean, of course, it's not geopolitical risk that is raising doubts about whether these models are fully sustainable, whether the massive investment by hyperscalers, increasingly financed by debt and increasingly by private debt, by private credit, is sustainable. But, I mean, these are sensitive to volatility in the market, and therefore, I mean, geopolitical developments could be an accelerator or a trigger of a correction, especially when we think that well, as I said a bit earlier, we are living in a world in which dependencies can be weaponized, and dependencies in the world, including chips, including rare earths, which are critical, of course, to the sector. Number two, I would list public debt levels, which are reaching record highs, including in the US. Of course, I mean, sovereign yields are quite sensitive to evolution of geopolitical risk and geopolitical conflicts. We've seen the steepening of yield curves, reflecting high uncertainties around fiscal trajectories and around the economic impact of geopolitics as well. So, I mean, of course, perception of sovereign risks are an area to be scrutinized, and especially as this is happening at the same time as geopolitical tensions mean perhaps weakening economies, and especially high needs to spend and invest in defense, in industrial policies for sovereignty concern, etc. So spending pressures going up at the same time as there can be more volatility in sovereign risk perception. Number three, I would list the rapid growth of NBFIs, of non-bank financial intermediaries. I mean, it's always been a cause for concerns, but I think here the question and the concern is not only the high level of leverage, but the increased interconnectedness with the rest of the financial system, and especially the strategies of some NBFIs, especially hedge funds, relying heavily on the dynamics of sovereign debt. So that's interconnected with what I just said about the geopolitical context being a potential source of volatility in sovereign debt markets. And fourth and last but not least in my list of top concerns, I would put cyber risk, which is of course a primary source of operational risk for the financial system, and especially vulnerable to increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. Of course, I mean, we saw a number of cyber attacks which was quite significantly last year, and geopolitical conflicts are contributing to this resurgence of hybrid warfare operations, which can manifest themselves in cyber risk for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now you've got an idea of what are the targets that could be affected by geopolitical risk in the financial system. And we are talking about risk, but risk is very difficult to define in general. We can talk, at least we can see geopolitical events. And they propagate because they've got consequences that are very often unattended. I remember when the war in Ukraine started, I learned, thanks to that indeed Ukraine was a producer of fertilizers. And now, with what is happening in Iran, I learned that Bangladesh is one of the main providers of goods in Europe, and they are using energy, and where their energy is coming from the Strait of Hormuz. So this kind of propagation in a lot of directions is something that is very difficult to understand also. And so maybe, Sébastien, you can give your opinion about how we've seen this kind of propagation.
Thank you. Yes, we're living in a world of where global value chains are widespread, are everywhere. And we know that they are far from neutral in terms of direction. So indeed, it's a channel of propagation of a variety of shocks, and this channel can be fairly complex to understand. It's also quite well established that in this kind of very complex networks, as the World Production Network is right now, you frequently have really critical nodes in critical hubs, if you like, in those networks. So even when you have a very large number of providers, of producers, it's very frequent that within a very complex network, you have a few key players, especially obvious in the electronic industry, for instance. You have tens of thousands of producers, and still you easily observe that you have some kind of quasi-monopolies in key dimensions, like TSMC for smelting, like ASML from lithography machines, etc. So there's a kind of paradox in having such a large number, such an incredible diversity of actors, and at the same time, extremely critical actors. Now, I think it's also the case that that's not new. We've been living in a world characterized by widespread global value chains for quite some time now. So the examples of the propagation of the shocks linked to the earthquake and tsunami in Tohoku in 2011, or the floods in Thailand the same year, have been widely studied, have been shown to disrupt production at the opposite side of the world in some cases. And somehow there's nothing new here. It's important. It's very difficult to understand, but it's not new. And the intensity of these links more or less has plateaued since the global financial crisis, if we refer to statistical measures. Now, what I think is also interesting to emphasize is the incredible resilience of the world, this networked world economy. We have been witnessing a lot of announced catastrophes still waiting to happen. Take the Liberation Day, the disruptive Trump trade policies. Catastrophic, as announced, right? And now take the number of the growth of world trade in volume in 2025, not definitive, but probably larger than 4% in volume. Okay, so world trade is fine, thanks for him. And take COVID even. I mean, disruptions during COVID were absolutely terrible, but when you look at it with hindsight, I think it's really astonishing how well the world economy reacted and how resilient it has been. And contrary to what is said frequently, the industries most dependent upon global value chains have not been the one most fragile. On the contrary, I think they have been the one reacting best to this opportunity. Think about how many masks we could have produced in France had we not been inserted in this international division of labor. And I think you realize that we could never have produced as many masks as we have been using at the time. Now, I think it's also important to think about differently about this geopolitical risk and ask what is special about geopolitical risk. Is it just about propagation? No, I think it's also about the nature of the risk. First, of course, it's an additional risk, okay, linked to geopolitical tensions. They are completely exogenous to, or largely exogenous to the economic sphere. So that's an additional source of risk. But it's also a different risk in terms of genesis, in terms of source, mainly because it's linked to a calculus, to an interaction between partners. And the probability of this risk happening is itself endogenous because it's linked to the way a partner or an enemy, in some cases, will understand, will evaluate the cost of disruption. And I think that's profoundly different from earthquake, even from the economic cycle. So there is really also something, I mean, it's really important, I think, to think about the probability of, the probability distribution of this risk and to think of it as something deeply endogenous linked to this interaction between players. And of course, this raises questions about precisely this cost of disruption, which, by the way, and I think it's very important, it's not just minus the gains from trade. It's very different. I mean, some steps in your production can be very small, yet the cost of disruption can be very large. Think about rare earths, for instance. The value of Chinese rare earth exports annually is a few $billion. I mean, at the scale of world trade, it's zero. And still, we see the power of this tool, of these export restrictions on rare earths as a geopolitical tool, as a source of political leverage. So I think it's very important. It points to different things to watch out in terms, of surveillance of this risk, in terms of diversity of producers, possibilities of substitution, cost of disruption, etc. To conclude, I think another interesting dimension in geopolitical risk is that it's making more and more common the use of a not completely new, but seldom used instrument in the trade arena, which is export restrictions. And export restrictions are interesting, so to say, because they are leading to a fragmentation of world markets. And so they've been used for a long time, but until a few years ago, they were mainly used really only in relation with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and things really like this, very narrowly defined. Now that they are more common, they have significant consequences. And these consequences are, in particular, I think, in many cases, a rigidification, a fragmentation of world supply, which limits the degrees of freedom of world production faced with shocks. And then, in that case, it's not only geopolitical shocks, it's that geopolitical constraints are reducing the adjustment capacities of the world economy. This has been, I think, pretty obvious in the semiconductor industry following COVID, because that was the time as well when the Trump administration and the Biden administration afterward had been applying very strong export restrictions of semiconductors to China. And I think it contributed a lot to the disorganization, the chaos in that industry, the difficulty to cope with the sudden surge of demand. That was not geopolitical, the surge of demand, but the adjustment capacity were reduced as a result. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we see that the way events are propagating is a multi-scale on a network. So that's something that is very sophisticated and multi-scale in time, so different time horizons, because it recomposes, actors are changing their views and reacting to what is happening, but also multi-scale in terms of geographies. And the information we can have, the data, Marie-Brière was mentioning alternative data that to understand these hidden risks are potentially very useful. And so how to build technically, I mean scientifically, indicators using this collection of data that are available at different time scales on different regions, not with a perfect synchronization, far from that. How can we do that? So Anna, the question is for you.
Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you, Charles-Albert, for this question. Yeah, indeed. So we have nowadays available many alternative data, and so there are different risk indicators that we can classify in three main categories. So we can have we have market-based indicators, text-based, and macro-based indicators. And so I would like to point out that different risk indicators are not just alternative measures of the same object, but they actually embed different representation of the way economy works and the way risk propagates. So for instance, let's talk about market-based indicators like the VIX. So these indicators are high frequency and forward-looking, and they capture very well changes in the financial conditions. But other risks, like for instance disruptions in the supply chain, are captured only indirectly by these risk indicators through how this risk affects the asset prices or expectations. Then if you move to the text-based indicators, so they take a different approach with respect to market-based indicators, and this is what we have seen in the presentation by Matteo Iacovello. And so they use information about information from news and from narratives. And so in this sense, so by construction, they capture multi-channel propagation in terms of contents, in the sense that they give information in terms of the type of shock and of the origin of shocks. But they don't give us an information in terms of, they don't model the structure of the propagation, so the network structure that characterizes the propagation of shocks. Then this type of indicators are known as, to be noisy, as we have just learned also from the presentation by Matteo Iacovello. And the point is that it's not that the raw data, the point is not that the approach itself is noisy, is that the raw data are noisy. And so what is particularly interesting in the contribution in the paper just presented by Matteo Iacovello is that by using appropriate methods like AI method or LLM method, we can extract the signal. Okay, so we can reduce the noise and have a signal that is less volatile. Now we have a third type of risk indicators. These are the macro-based indicators that are constructed by using macroeconomic data or by using survey. So this type of indicators are, for instance, measure of uncertainty, and they are very useful in order to assess the impact of this risk, of these shocks on the economy on a whole. So they are useful to assess the aggregate impact. So for instance, the impact on GDP, the impact on employment or investment. And the characteristics of these indicators is that they are low frequency, so they are typically monthly or quarterly. They are available with a delay, okay, so after a shock produces, and they give aggregate information. Now, if you go back to the global supply chain, so the global supply chains form a network of interdependencies across countries, across sectors, where shocks propagate depending on who is connected to whom. And the point is that all these traditional indicators don't really capture this, this network structure, okay, because they don't have, so they don't use the modeling of the network to construct the indicator. So I mean, overall, the methodology that is used to construct these risk indicators is very important because it impacts what we can see from these indices in terms of parts of the economy or in terms of risk and in terms of shock. So I think that this naturally leads to a second question that is whether we can combine all the sources of information, the sources of alternative data that are used to construct all these indices and to combine them to construct I mean, something coherent and informative also about the global supply chains. And I think that here is where high-dimensional data and high-dimensional methods play an important role. So high-dimensional methods like machine learning or artificial intelligence methods. And so the point, as I have said, is that the signal is there, but the data are very rich, so the signal is hidden in this immensity of the data. Okay, so the risk is that we can lose the signal, and so we need to use appropriate methods like selection or shrinkage or factor models in order to extract a meaningful signal. And so this is something that I have also encountered in my own work when I was using Google search data together with Laurent Ferrara, where actually we have a lot of data, so we had a ultra high dimension, and the problem was to extract relevant information. So in our case was to nowcast GDP. So we wanted to have meaningful information and also relevant and interpretable information. And this is related to what is known in the macroeconometric literature as targeted selection, in the sense that when we have these alternative data sets that are very rich, we need to select as a first step the variables that can be useful for what we can for what we want to study. And the second point is how we aggregate, how we should aggregate, or whether we should or not aggregate data in terms of frequency. So this arises the last question, that is the question about mixed frequency. When we want to deal, when we have a rich data set, we have a rich, different type of frequency. For instance, we can work with monthly data, quarterly data, weekly data, and daily data. And the question is, how can we mix this information so there is an easier approach, that is, we aggregate everything at the lowest frequency, but of course this is simple, but the risk is that we lose information. Otherwise, we can develop more advanced methods in order to extract, to exploit the high frequency information and to work at the high frequency. Yeah, so just to conclude, I think that overall we are moving from a world where we summarize the risk with single indicators to one where we need to integrate multiple and heterogeneous signals in a coherent framework, and this requires modeling, so machine learning and AI challenges, and also conceptual challenges, because we want to have a method that works but that remains interpretable.
Thank you very much. So now with the first three interventions, we know what are the weaknesses of the financial system thanks to Dorothée. We know how this kind of geopolitical events are propagating thanks to Sébastien, and with Anna we've got a hope to build indicators on all that. So maybe if you join to make a startup, we will have a wonderful dashboard of indicators of the financial risk and the weaknesses for the financial system. And Julien, I can ask you the question because you are a former asset manager. Now, if you had this dashboard, what can you do? Because in statistics we say count to understand, understand to act. So how to act? Because otherwise you've got this kind of Christmas tree effect. You've got a lot of red lights everywhere, but you don't know what to do. So when you're a portfolio manager, what kind of actions can you do? Is hedging make sense? Is diversification something that has a sense today in front of geopolitical risk?
Okay, I'll do my best to answer a question, which is not easy. So as we've seen with geopolitical shocks, geopolitical tensions, we have new risks, and they require some new ways of diversification or additional ones, and the same for hedging when it's doable. So a first distinction that can be made about assets that are invested, if they are movable or not movable. For example, real estate. Okay, so if you are a foreigner invested in Russian real estate, in Gulf real estate, there you're kind of fully impacted. You cannot do much. When you invest in an issuer, let's say in a company, that's kind of intermediate. The company as a part of its activity cannot be completely changed, overhauled radically, but a part can be adjusted over time. As Sébastien has explained us, we've seen some very strong adjustment adaptations in the wake of the invasion of an important part of the Ukrainian territory by Russian troops. And then among the very movable assets, you can have, if you have the logistics, like raw materials and so on, if you can move them, etc. Concerning the investment in issuers, so equity paper or bond or bill securities, the main criteria of diversification outside geopolitical risks are kind of what is the sector, what is the activity, and second, what is the geographical breakdown of sales, and third, let's say the yield curve and the corresponding maturities of expected cash flows in the future. With geopolitical shock, geopolitical tensions, we can see that you need absolutely to add to that something which is already present in diversification, but before Ukraine and Russian crisis, it's everything that is supply chain procurement, supplying. And it needs for investors to dig deeper into that, to see what are the risks on that, how it can be adjusted and so on, to build some indicators. Okay, and an addition, so it will ask also, it asks issuers on their side to communicate much more on these criteria. We have seen with the rise of ESG over the last 25 years that companies, first, they manage more cautiously some aspects of sourcing and so on. And we see the same thing for also on supply, on procurement, for geopolitical
So ESG, you were thinking about energy sovereignty and geopolitics.
Yes, for example. Okay, in addition to this criteria, there is also the huge upheaval about which Dorothée has talked, is that we have a confluence of geopolitical risks with, let's say, state fiscal situations. For the last decades in the Western world, we have had like a huge stability in fiscal situations from about, let's say, 1965 until maybe a couple of years ago. We have had huge stability in fiscal situations of core issuers. Let's say it has started to change quite significantly from, let's say, 2008, and with COVID, some additional layers, and so on. So they were, because all these papers issued by states like Germany, France, US, and so on, were kind of, they were a part of the basket of, let's say, risk-free assets, at least for the short-term paper. And now with both the evolution of fiscal situations, the evolution of risk of sanctions, it's a bit different. So genuine risk-free asset now is a perimeter which is significantly decreasing. So that brings us to something potentially, let's say, which could become central, is that, as said Sébastien, up to now, the world trade and the world finance has done quite well in front of all these shocks and so on. But when we look at the past, to extreme situations like World War I, World War II, when a country or a region or the world enters a period like that, the object of an investor, of an individual, an institution, an asset manager is not exactly the same. So it's not to yield, to make the maximum of money for the risk you take, is to preserve the maximum of your wealth, and sometimes to lose the less. So in extreme situations, there can be some investors who could be interested to, if you tell them, I can almost guarantee you that in 10-year time, in any state of the world, you will have at least 50% of what you have today. So in certain contexts, that can be interesting. So the future will tell if to what extent such demand or market for that develop or not. Another part of geopolitical risks for asset managers is for their activity themselves. The way they manage funds, the way they buy shares, buy securities, sell securities, and custody them, keep them. And that's where we see the role of central securities depositories and custodians. So generally, when you buy a stock or a bond, it is the final depository is a central securities depository, and normally there is one, maybe two, but it's quite rare, but normally only one for the security you buy. For example, if you buy on Euronext Paris an Air Liquide share, it will be finally deposited at Euroclear France, formerly Sicovam. Okay, but when you buy a foreign security, then it's a bit different. And because your custodian will use the service itself of a sub-custodian in the other country, which in turn will hold on your behalf to the central securities depository of the country. Okay, so for example, 6 in Switzerland or in Spain. Okay, so that's one thing. And the asset manager there is confronted to a diversity of risks on such type of risks depending on the client. So, for example, for a French client going through Amundi or BNP Paribas Asset Management, if he buys through a French asset manager in a French law fund and not a Luxembourg one, invested in French securities, let's say there is a part of the chains which is kind of, let's say, sovereign, purely French. But if the customer is Chinese, for example, and those companies have Chinese customers, they may have some different requirements. And they might be very attentive in the mandate, in the rules. So in the current period, in the coming years, we could see strong evolutions about that and some evolutions of the contract signs, particularly on these clauses. Okay, also about, also in the different ways of detention, we've seen, for example, for gold, there are different ways of owning gold. You can own physical gold yourself, okay, as a private person, an institution, as a fund. But when you own it physically, then you have the choice to own it in your own safe box or warehouse for a larger quantity. But then you have the location of the warehouse. Is it in the country of the investor or in the country of the asset manager? Is it in a foreign country? If you're based in a country that can be invaded, you can think it's a good idea to put a part of it or the bulk of it in other countries. For example, in the 30s or during the Cold War, some European central banks said, okay, let's put a part of our gold, for example, in the US. But some decades later, if you're less trustful on your partnership with the US, and you think the probability of being invaded has decreased, you can think it's a good idea to repatriate some of it. That's a movement we have seen, for example, by the Bundesbank the last 15 years. Okay, and if we continue on more regular, let's say, more classical criteria about issuers, currently we can see them investors like companies that themselves are very careful about their own diversification, either in their own assets or in their own way of functioning. And that goes to the size of issuers. So,
I think we are running out of time.
Okay.
so we went from the fascinating world of supply chain of production goods to supply chain of financial services and depository. And before closing this roundtable, maybe one word of wrap up. I have the sentiment that we talked a lot about stationarity indeed. Behind all what you said, it's about how the world is changing and how the data that we have continue to describe what will be the future. And what strikes me is that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were talking about forecasting that says that we were very confident and we trust a lot the stationarity of the data, because when you want to forecast with the data, it means that you believe that you are in something that you can draw the continuation of a curve and it will continue like that. Then with alternative data, we forged the word nowcasting. So somehow the horizon is going closer to you. So you don't know exactly how you will be the future, but you are very happy to nowcast, to know what is the present. And now we are jumping in foresight that is just scenarios. So we don't use any data and we want to understand what could be the scenarios, and then we gather data to infer what will happen in this scenario. So I see big changes in the way we model data, and we use data in modeling. And in a world where AI says that we will not need any modeling, indeed it's exactly the opposite. What we need is foresight. It means exactly models and very robust assumptions, looking out of the data instead of following the data, because as Sébastien said, the world is changing and adapting. So we know that even what we observed is no more valid tomorrow when there is a shock, this kind of shock especially. Similarly, for the financial system that adapted a lot, we've seen during the war in Ukraine, that what has been put in place during the pandemic worked quite decently. And so the world is adapting, and it means what is the value of data that describes the past. And maybe we can conclude on that. So it's a lot of, even with only 4 participants and panelists, we are opening a lot of areas of research, so it's a very good start for the Forum of Risk. Thank you.
Move to parallel sessions. So there are 3 rooms, should be indicated, 1 here and 2 others.